I'm Jamie Pennebaker, and I'm a social psychologist who, over the last several years, has become absolutely fascinated with the nature of words and language. And the bottom line of what I'm going to be saying today is the words we use in everyday language, whether spoken or written, reflect who we are. They reflect our personality, our relationships with others, and provide a window to people's basic beings, if you like. Now, part of this is a story. And what I want to do is give you a little background in terms of how I got where I am and how it's relevant to, I think, much of the work that's being done at this conference. About over 20 years ago, I was involved in a lot of research dealing with mind-body issues. I was really primarily interested in the nature of stress and physiology. And I became intrigued with a phenomenon that had been known for a generation, which was when people have traumatic experiences, they're much more likely to have health problems. And as I got into this world, I became intrigued with a phenomenon that I discovered, which was if people have a trauma that they then keep secret from their closest friends, that served as an even bigger risk factor for illness. In other words, having a major secret in your life is a threat to your health. It increases stress, you sleep more poorly, it compromises your immune system and so forth. Which led me to the question, what if we brought people in the lab and asked them to reveal secrets? Which led me to the idea of, well, what if we had them, say, talk about them, or even better, write about these upsetting experiences? Would that have a positive effect on health? So beginning in the 80s, we did our very first study with college students. We brought them in. They were randomly assigned to either write about a traumatic experience or to write about superficial topics. And we asked them to write for 15 minutes a day for 3 days, sometimes 4 days, depending on the study. It turned out to be an incredibly powerful experiment in that when people are asked to write about horrible traumas in their lives, they really do. They write about the profoundly disturbing stories. And what we discovered is in the months after writing about these traumas, people's physical health improved. They went to the doctor about half the rate as people in the control conditions. And then we started to do work with immune function, where we would draw blood before the experiment and then after the experiment several weeks later, and found that when people wrote about traumatic experiences, there would be enhancements in immune function. And then other labs started to get involved, and over the last 20 years, there have been well over 200 studies published looking at the nature of this, what we call expressive writing on health. Now, by the early 90s, I became really obsessed with what is it about writing that makes such a difference? And we had done lots of experiments to try to find this out, as had other labs, and no clear answers were emerging. And it occurred to me, wouldn't it be nice to go in and actually look at the writing to get a sense of what people were saying? Because if we could, the idea would be, we could actually identify the features of writing, and then in theory, we could train people to be better writers. There might be a healthier way to write. Well, this turned out to be a bit of a difficulty because we would get judges to read all these essays and make all the ratings, and what we essentially did was discover a way to make all our judges depressed. And judges turned out they don't agree very well, and we never really found much. And it occurred to be much more efficient to do this with a computer. So we tried to find computer programs that would do what we wanted and couldn't find one. And so I figured, well, how hard could it be to write a program? I had taken Fortran in college, so figured anybody could do it. And I had a graduate student at the time, Martha Francis, who who'd spent several years in the computer world. And I told her, Martha, we can do this. I used the word we advisedly. I said, we can do this. I'm sure we can do it in 3 weeks. Well, 3 years later, when we finally got the program working, it turned out to be a kind of interesting program. And the reason it took so long to develop this program is we wanted to come up with categories of words. So there would be, say, positive emotion words and anger words and other negative emotion words, and then pronouns and prepositions and cognitive words and so forth. We had to have judges all agree what words we wanted this computer program to look for. The program ended up being just called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, LIWC, which is pronounced Luke. So when I refer to this computer program Luke, that's what I'm referring to. The Luke program emerged into being a very nice little program, and many of you are familiar with it. It basically goes in and analyzes any kind of text, as long as it's digital, and in Word or text format, and provides output along about 70 different dimensions. We went back to our earlier studies of expressive writing, and we did start to find a profile of people who benefited from writing. Basically, the people who benefited from writing tended to use more positive emotion words when writing about traumas, but more powerfully, they increased in their use of cognitive words. Cognitive words like what we call insight words, words like realize, understand, know, meaning, words such as that, as well as causal words, words like because, cause, effect, reason, rationale. In other words, people who were benefiting from writing started to construct a story. We also started to find some interesting and kind of bizarre things with pronouns, that people who bounced around in the way they used pronouns from one writing session to the next also tended to benefit. Now this brings us to the mid-90s, and by this time we were starting to download lots of things from the internet, and we were also, at least I was starting to watch these words as we would get different samples in. And I would frequently get big effects. There'd be big sex differences, there'd be big age differences, there'd be other kinds of differences, and they never made any sense. Until one day I was on a flight and I was reading a book by George Miller called The Science of Words. And it was one of those books that hit me at exactly the right time and had a profound effect. In it, he talked about two different types of words that are associated with different regions of the brain. One kind of words he referred to as general content words. These are kind of the heavy words that we use. So the podium is on the stage. That phrase, the podium is on the stage, the really only heavy words there are podium and stage. All those other words are function words. The, is on, the. All of those are, they're called function words. And there's only a small number in English and all languages. They are generally pronouns, prepositions, articles, conjunctions, auxiliary verbs, quantifiers, a few adverbs, and a few others. In English, there's about 500, only of which about 150 are common. Now, what's interesting about these words is they're processed in the brain differently than these content words. These heavy content words tend to be nouns and regular verbs. And these function words are more associated with the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe in the brain is interesting, it's Broca's area, because it's this area that's associated with what we know, many social processes, cognitive processes, and also personality processes as well. And the reason this interested me is I've been finding all of these personality differences in these junk words, these function words, and now it all started to make sense. Now, this is kind of the beginning of the whole story, and what makes this beginning so interesting to me is it started to open these doors to understanding social and psychological features and how we can use these function words to get a sense of people's psychological state. And for many of you, this doesn't make much sense because if you've done any language work at all, you've always been focusing on the more heavy content words, the words that programs like latent semantic analysis and other programs do that are looking at what people in artificial intelligence have always been interested in, and that is the content of speech. But these function words are reflecting the style of speech, how people are talking to one another, how they are relating to their audience, and also how they're relating to the topic that they are looking at. Now, I'd like to give you just one very quick example. And if you know the answer to these questions because I have told you in a workshop, then you cannot vote. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. And the first question is, do men and women use language differently? Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. The answer on this question is yes, they do. And it's quite different. Now I'm going to ask you, who uses the following words more, men or women? And you just raise your hand. So we'll start off with first person singular, I, me, and my. Who uses that more? How many people think men use I more? How many think women do? Okay. We, us, and our. How many think men use we more? How many think women do? Okay. Emotion words. How many think men use emotion words more? How many think women do? Okay. How about articles, a, and the? How many think men use articles more? How many think women do? Oh, come on, guys, you got to vote. I'm going to say that was a 50-50 break, just to be nice. Cognitive words, words like because, cause, effect, reason, rationale, understand, etc. How many think men use cognitive words more? How many think women do? Slight edge for men, I'm going to give that. And social words, references to friend, talk, things like that. How many think men use them more? How many think women do? Okay, I'm proud to announce that you do just as horribly as every other group I've ever dealt with. Here's the good news. You're as bad as people at Harvard and Cambridge, and you're as bad as actually you're not as good as an old age home that I spoke at recently. You missed all the questions but one. And this is what is so intriguing about this, and I'd like to deconstruct what this means. First of all, I. Pronouns tell us where people are paying attention. And there's a big difference between men and women use the word I across the board, cross cultures, cross ages, consistently. We is a complex word. Half the time we really means you, as in talking to my students, we need to analyze the data. That doesn't mean we need to, it means you. Okay, there actually are no differences between, it was a trick question, there are no differences between men and women, no differences between men and women to speak of in terms of emotion words. Articles, huge differences. Men use articles at much higher rates. Why is that? Because the use of articles is a marker of a concrete objects and things. And social words, you got that one right, thank God. Women do make references to other people more, and so they do in fact use more social words. Cognitive words, women use cognitive words at much higher rates. Why? Men tend to talk about objects and things. Women tend to talk about people and relationships. People and relationships are much more complex than objects and things. Believe it or not, a carburetor is a lot easier to understand than is a relationship. Why is Bob dating Sally when in fact he's in love with somebody else? That requires far more cognitive processing than why doesn't carburetor work? You know, so this starts to give you an idea. By looking at these little words, we start to get a sense of underlying processes at work. Now, over the last few years, we've found huge differences in age, sex, social class in terms of how people use language across settings. We find big differences between people telling the truth and when people lie. We do, if we look at any given text, and we have a wide number of texts, there are big, big differences. We find differences, we can use language to get a sense of social connections. Whether looking at a group, or looking at a Twitter community, or looking at a Craigslist community, we can start looking at how any two people are sharing their use of function words and get a sense of how they are connecting. We are now able to predict long-term relationships, whether they're going to succeed or fail, simply by the way they use words when they are communicating with others. I could go and you can see I could talk about this for months, but the point to all of this is the words that we are using every day, these invisible words that you can't hear, that you can't process consciously, provide a window into how individuals are thinking. If you'd like to see more about this and actually see the papers and summaries, you can go to my website. You can just Google my name, and I have multiple websites that you can work from. So I'll stop here and open this up for questions. Thank you.